This is developing Nagios XI components and wizards, and we will do the same Q&A thing towards the end. If you have a question during the middle, please raise your hand so that I can get over to you, and we'll get your question on the recording. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Omann.
Thanks. I'm Jake Omann. I'm a developer at Nagios, and I'm going to be talking about developing XI components and wizards. First of all, a component can add pretty much any functionality you want to XI, and there's actually a lot of components that we use that are in XI that add a lot of extra functionality, such as scheduled reporting, event handlers. Nagios BPI, if anyone's used that, is actually a component that is integrated into XI. You can access internal and external versions of the API with any component. Configuration wizard is supposed to make life easy for the user. It's normally auto-completing for a lot of different kinds of config wizards, and it will allow you to basically set up all of the actual config files for a certain host or service. It's a step-by-step process. There's 6 steps. It's fairly simple. It's easy. It's quick. And you can write your own for pretty much any type of host, any type of service that you want. There's a few links to docs that are really, really helpful. Developing a component is the first document. These are actual Nagios docs, and it does talk about the API in that document. Mostly because you're going to be using the API inside the component to be able to get things like the current host status or the current service statuses and all that kind of information that you're probably going to need if you want to do something with it. You can also do a lot more than that, though. You can get like acknowledgments and all that kind of stuff. It's a good document to read if you want to work on components. The config wizard development is also another document that we have written. This one really shows you like the guidelines of how we do ours, and it gives you a little bit of information about the kinds of stuff that you're going to need to put into yours to be able to make it function. And there's an example for each of these inside the PDFs. There's a link to an example. One of the things that we like to say is that most of them are not encrypted. So you can look at other ones that do something similar or do something that you want yours to do and look at it and see how it's doing it. And that's a very, very good way to learn how a config wizard or a component works. So first off, we're going to go through components. A basic component consists of a few optional parts. You can do config settings, a display page, or a group of pages, something that you're going to see from the XI interface, and then callbacks. You do not need all of the pieces. You can have a component that just has a config setting. You can have a component that just has a display page. You can have a component that only does callbacks, that you actually never see anything but the component actually being in your XI from the admin page. A good example of these is the global event handler only has a config settings page. So you go to the admin page, you go down and find the global event handler, and you type inside the config settings what you want it to do, and then you save it, and it runs a callback every time there's a notification or an event. And there's no display page on XI anywhere in the user pages or the admin pages or the reports. There's no place that you go to see those global event handlers other than the config settings. And that's part of the functionality of a component, is that you can do whatever you want with it. Some components have display pages that you interact with it. Nagios BPI is a component, and it has a group of pages that you actually go and interact with. So when you click on Nagios BPI, you get to go through the tabs to click on the components, or click on the pieces of the component. The component file system is pretty simple. It's the component name, all lowercase, preferably no underscores or spaces, but underscores work too if you don't want to put it all as one word. And then you do the component name, .inc.php is going to be where you put your config settings, and it's going to have all the information that you're going to need. And then most people will do a component name.php as the actual page that's going to be displayed. which again is optional. Images can be added to an image folder, and you can include scripts, libraries, anything that you'd want to include in a normal script that you'd be running or a normal program that you'd be running on the side. An example is my bird's eye component if you ever wanted to download that. And that's also the example that we're going to be looking at throughout this components section. So the one thing that is required for a component is the init function, and it controls the component and the registration. It sets up what the component's config function is going to be, and it sets up the callbacks that you're going to register. And here is an example. It's probably really, really hard to see, but up here it says birdseye3 underscore component underscore name, and then it says birdseye3. So you have to have a name, and you have to have this right here be the name of your component. The reason being is because there's going to be a lot of components and a lot of other things inside your XI that may have a name that's similar. And you want to make sure that all of your functions are not going to crisscross with any other functions or any other functionality inside of XI. So as you can see, the function birdseye component init. So this is your function name, and it's called right here with your component name. And it's continuously, like all the underlined red is your component name. But it requires these component options inside of the init function, the name, the author, the description, title, version, date, and the config function at the very bottom, which is optional. You don't actually have to have that in there if you don't want a config function. So the init function does all this stuff and then registers the component with XI. And it's a pretty simple line. It's just register under component, and then your name, the name of the component, and then the arguments that you just wrote in this right here. And again, if you use one of the example ones that are given inside the PDFs, you're going to have all this written out, and it has little things like name the information, and it tells you what type of stuff you're going to want to put into these. It should be pretty self-explanatory, but there's going to be a little bit of helper comments in it to explain what you need to do. At the very bottom of this is also going to be the register callbacks. This is where you'd put all your callbacks that you're going to want to register. In birdseye, the only callback that it has is callback underscore menus underscore initialized, which actually is going to set up the menu item inside of XI. And it's actually calling birdseye3 underscore component underscore add menu, which is another function that's going to be shown in a little bit here. So the config settings, if you didn't catch this, is right here, the component configuration. It's birdseye3 underscore component underscore config underscore function, and that's actually a function that we're going to write. And this is going to create that settings button next to your configuration or your component in the component menu in the admin panel. So this settings button is going to be there if you have the component configuration function specified in that init function. Inside that function, you're going to have two cases in a switch statement. The first one going to be component config mode get settings HTML, and the second one component config mode save settings HTML. And the first one is going to display the information on the page that you're going to want to have people put in to input something like, you know, maybe for, I think I have an example here of something. If you have like a host that you want to specifically specify, or like an API key or something like that that you're going to want to put in there, you can put that in the settings. The other second thing is the callbacks. And inside the init function, you define the callbacks like callback name, component function, do stuff. There's a few callbacks that we'll talk through here. The first variable, it needs to be a valid callback, which there is a list. Well, it's not actually a list, but there are some inside of a PHP file that you'll want to look at. They're all defined, but some of the helpful ones are listed in the presentation if you want to be able to go back and look at them. And the second variable is the name of the function that you want to run. So an example of this would be right up there, and then the function that you're going to want to run is at the bottom. Component name underscore function do stuff, and then it's going to take CB type and a CB args. And this is going to be used to be able to grab array values that are passed to this component. So if you wanted to get the service name inside of this function that's being run, you're going to use the grab array var under, or from the CB args, you're going to grab service. And it's going to let you grab that service name and use that inside that function. So an example of these registered callbacks is right here. I have 3 examples of some that are pretty helpful if you're trying to make a component that is going to do something in your XI instance. The menu item callback, the host service action button, and the host service tab. For quick actions and tabs, these are the callback definitions. They're pretty simple, and I just have a little display of where the tabs are going to be and where the quick actions are going to be if you do use those. And a good note is that the host and the service ones are different. So if you do one for just hosts, it's only going to show up on hosts. If you do one for just services, it's only going to show up on services. You can use the exact same function if you want, but it might not send the host, or it's not going to send a service to you if you click on host detail, but it will send a service and a host if you click on service detail, because it knows what the host is. It doesn't know what the service is going to be if you click on host. And actually creating a quick action button, the one on the bottom, is you actually have to put a bunch of HTML into the CB args, which is passed by reference, because you are actually going to be filling it with items. So you can add more than one quick action button into this list of quick action buttons down here with one function if you wanted to. But you're going to have to put them inside this CB args actions array. And it's just plain HTML. You get to do like an li with a div, and then you put your link into it, and you can do whatever you want there. You could even just put some information, like maybe you want to just know that a service has something going on with it, and you want to just see a quick number there or something. You can do something like that too. It doesn't have to be a link. The example here is of the reactor event handler, and it actually has a link to pop up a window that lets you like test a reactor event. And creating a tab is just a little bit different. The content is going to be put into like a variable. It has to be a string though, so it's going to be a string of HTML. And then you're going to put that into an array that's going to have an ID and a title, and then the string that's the content. And it's going to have like an ID. I have for this one reactor event handler because it's from the reactor event handler one, and then the title, and then you add it to the tabs in the CB arg or CB data, which is actually the same as CB args, but since they're different functions, they had different names. So in CB args, you'd put in tabs. Adding a display page is really, really simple. You don't actually have to add a menu item. You could just go to it from the URL, but you're going to want to add a menu item if you want someone to actually use your page. So in the actual callback, in the function that it adds, it has a little section here that's marked with the red that actually finds a value, like an integer value, of where you want to put the menu item, and then the actual call to make that or to add that menu item is right here, and making the link is actually right here. So this little part on the end, way over there, is just the name of the actual file that's going to be pulled when you click that button, and it's a lot of code. So again, that's why I do say that you should probably look at an example, because this is going to be probably going over your head right now, and you're not going to be able to remember it. But I guarantee you that if you look at one of the components, it's going to have something similar to this, and it will be, you can copy it and change it to what you want it to do. So, and that's pretty much the basics of a component, and inside of that, you can do whatever you want. So once you have that link to that PHP file, it's gonna come up in that little frame in XI, and you can do whatever you want. You can add whatever functionality you want there. You could send it to a different website if you wanted to. You could have it go search Google for you. So you can do anything you want inside that. For config wizards, there's a set of guidelines that is in the PDF, but we'll go over them real quick here too. It needs to be free from fatal syntax and notice messages. It will not install on your XI if it has any of those. You should never run update or insert SQL queries on Nagios or any of the Nagios QL databases. You should never need to. You could if you really wanted to, but you should never need to. You get most of your data from the, it passes all the data for you, and then you send all the data to the CCM with a call at the end, and it will populate everything for you, so you shouldn't need to touch the database at all. You should avoid using post, get, and globals, since the post variable is already located in an array called inargs, and you're going to use the grab array var again, like you saw in the components. So if you wanted a form variable, you do a grab array var, and then inargs var name, and then you put a default value if you want one. Most newer versions of Wizards store the data being passed between the steps inside a session. It used to be that it would be a serialized array. So if you look at some older components, you're going to see that it passes it with a weird serialized array through a form. So you'll see that data being passed inside the form if you look at it, which sometimes it will erase that data if it didn't get passed. So a better way to do it is to put it inside the session, and that's actually one of the guidelines inside the PDF, and the example in the PDF actually uses that way. So the directory structure for a configuration wizard is a lot bigger than a component because it's more structured in general. You actually have a name for your directory structure. So this is for the MongoDB server wizard. It's named MongoDB_server, and inside of logos, you'd want to put whatever PNG or GIF that you want for your logo. That's going to be what shows right next to your host. In plugins, you're going to need a plugin. I'm not going to go into how to write plugins, but the same type of plugins that work with core are actually what you're putting in here. It's going to overwrite, or it's not going to overwrite if the plugin's already there, I believe, but it does set up the plugin if you do not already have it. So if you have check mongodb.py, if you already have that plugin, it's not going to matter, but you're going to need to put that into your plugins folder, because if you have an XI instance that doesn't have that plugin, you're going to want to add that. So if you're using a plugin that already exists by default in XI, you do not have to add it, but if you're going to use your own, you're going to have to add it. For templates, MongoDB_server, it should be named the same as your config wizard, and it's going to be a .config. It's actually just a few lines of template for your core config, and your config.xml is going to be just a few lines of XML that's going to tell XI what these things are. So it's going to tell XI what the logo, the plugin, and the template, where they are. Install.sh is optional, but if you need a required package that isn't already installed, you might have to throw it in there to be able to install to make your config wizard work. This one actually does have, MongoDB server does have an install.sh because it needs pymongo, which isn't on the server by default. MongoDB_server.inc.php is the file that's going to have all the information that is going to display all the HTML. It's going to have all the stuff that's actually in the wizard that someone's going to see when they click on it. So templates are the first thing we're going to look at. It's required to add the command the wizard is going to be using to Nagios, to the core. So MongoDB_server.config is the one that we're going to be using for this example. It defines the host, and this is changed. The XI wizard _MongoDB_host right here is named specifically for this wizard. If I had another wizard called MongoDB_queries, query, you would have to change that host name. Actually, you wouldn't have to change the host name, but it would be in your best interest to make every config wizard have its own separate host and service definitions. So under here, you can see that I was making a MongoDB underscore query one. So this one says MongoDB server underscore service. But you define the host, you define the service, and these are pretty generic. The check command right there is actually what you're defining underneath it. So where it says you have a check command right here for check DB or MongoDB underscore server. So the command right here, the command name is check MongoDB underscore server. Those have to match because that's what it's going to be using to actually check the server. And underneath that is going to be your plugin that you have, that you added. And you're going to have to pass all the arguments that you want it to pass. And then the args that you're going to pass it from the config wizard are going to be in arg1, arg2, arg3, arg4. And the host address is all in there. And user1 is going to be the location. So you're going to need that in there too. For the config XML, it's really, really simple. And it just has 3 optional things because your plugin doesn't, if you do not have a plugin, like a special plugin, if you're using a default XI plugin, then you wouldn't need to have that plugins. But it's just telling you where the file name or the file name of the plugin is that's inside the plugins folder. So your file name is check underscore mongodb.py, but it's in plugins / and then file name. So for templates, it's the same way, templates and then / file name, logos / file name. And that's all this is really for. It's to make sure that XI knows where these files are and what the file names are for them. The example code for actually initializing this is in code or in config wizard helper.inc. Sorry, this is in mongodb underscore server.inc.php. This is actually the main file that we're going to be doing everything in. It has that helper function is gonna need to be in there, or the helper include right up here. And then you're going to have your config wizard in it, and then you're going to have to actually start your wizard, and you're going to name it, and you're going to pass an array just like in your component. And your component or your array is going to have the name, the version, the type, which is going to be config wizard underscore type underscore monitoring. And then you're going to have the description, the display title, and the function of it that is actually going to be displaying the HTML and everything. And then you're going to have the preview image, which is going to be that image that was in the logos if you want one. Then you're going to register the config wizard in with the name and the args that you passed. Okay, and the actual function that we have defined right here under config wizard function is going to have a bunch of stages. And I know it's really hard to read up top, but you're going to be passing mode, in args, out args, and result, which is a lot of different pieces, but they are all important. So the wizard name is going to be defined up here, and it's going to be MongoDB server. And then you need to initialize it with the result 0 and nothing for output. And you're going to want to have the this one actually uses the old way of doing the passing of data. So it's actually going to be doing the serialized. So this part right here is not actually really going to be required. In a newer one, you'll see it in the example one. But the switch is important because you'll want to start with the config mode or config wizard mode get stage 1 HTML, which is going to display all the HTML for stage 1. Stage 1 is actually step 2 inside of Nagios XI, and I'll show you that in just a second here. This one actually has a check prerequisites function, but it's not required. If you don't have any prerequisites, there's no reason to have the check prerequisites. So there's stages. Nagios has steps in XI and the stages in the code. So the steps in XI, it's going to say step 2, but it's actually going to be stage 1 in your code. So this is just kind of a little helpful slide if you're going to be like doing it on your own and you want to actually grab this presentation, look at it, and you could go through it and say, okay, step 1 is actually or step 2 is actually stage 1. So for stage 1, each stage has 2 sections, HTML and a validate. So you get the HTML and then you validate that stage before you pass it to the next stage. So at the very end of the stage, you want to send any error messages out and change the result to 1 to tell Nagios that there was an error, so stay on the page that it's already on. And it'll display the errors for you and it'll keep you on that page. When result is 0, it means that it's okay. When the result is 1, it means that there's an error, so you will stay on that page. And the first stage is for gathering information. Normally the host name, the username, the password, and maybe like a database. So for MongoDB, we have all that. We have the host name, the IP address, the host address, and then we have the username, the password, and the MongoDB server or the MongoDB database that has the server information that you want. And this is stage 1 running in Nagios XI, and as you can see, it is step 2. You have the address, the port, the username, the password. And then stage 2 is, again, it's the same as stage 1, just instead of stage 1, it says stage 2 in the 2 switches. Stage 2 is going to allow you to select what you want to monitor and how you want to monitor it. Some wizards are going to auto-populate this information. A good example is if you are using like the auto discovery wizard or something, it will populate the second stage with any information because it will go and talk to the server, and the server will send back some information that you're going to want to auto-populate. Maybe you know that this server wants or has a lot of data going through it, and it knows that it needs to set the warning to a certain level, or it needs to set the critical to a certain level. Clicking back on this stage should repopulate the fields when you go forward. So when you go back and forward in any of these stages, it should repopulate, which is what that session value is for. And this is an example of stage 2 in XI, where it shows the address, the hostname, the port, and the username that you filled out in the stage before it. And it is showing you a bunch of different metrics that you're going to want to monitor, and each of these is going to become a service. So this is going to be a service and a service and a service, and you have to put in the warning and the critical thresholds for those. Stage 3 and the final stage, these ones are optional. They are populated already with monitoring settings, and you can't change what is displayed in stage 3, but you can add to what is displayed in stage 3. So you could confirm information that you already put in, or you can just leave it blank. You're going to have to make sure that you do pass the data that you got in the other stage on to the next stage from here. And the final stage is also going to be stage 6 or step 6 in your XI, and it's normally just used for passing data. It's not used for much other than that. You wouldn't use it for getting any more data from the person, because you can click finish before that stage, which would skip through to the final stage. This is the final stage after that. So in this case, you see case config wizard mode get objects. Before that is this config wizard mode get final stage. But in get objects, you're going to have all the information that you pulled. This one uses that serialized array that I was talking about, and it's actually going to get the services out of that serialized array, and it's going to send it into whatever you're going to need to make for the core configuration. So here's actually the get objects, and this is something that you're probably going to need to look at on your own because there's a lot of information here. But basically, it creates an array for each object, and you're going to have to edit the array based on what you want to do. And you're going to put that into an array called objects. And then once you do have that full array of objects, you're going to put it in the out args, and it's actually going to send those objects to the configuration, and it's going to configure it for you, and then it's going to save it, and it's going to restart Nagios. And just some examples are inside the PDFs, like I had said, and some tips, again, is going to be to check out what actually happens inside the configuration wizard. You're going to have to look through the PHP files for other ones if you have an idea of something that you want to do and you want to learn more about it, because of the fact that it is going to be easily changeable. You'll be able to see the steps in action. You'll be able to click through, and you'll be able to see, okay, so this is what step 2 looks like. You're going to be able to edit that step, and you're going to be able to say, okay, I want someone to enter this, this, and this. And then you'll be able to see it being passed, and you'll be able to say, okay, now I'm in switch for stage 2. And then you're going to be able to put whatever you want in there. And is there any questions about this? Troy?
Just with the plugin, if you have an updated plugin when you upload the wizard again, it will update that plugin in the folder. That's handy for when you develop, if you're developing a plugin in parallel and it becomes a newer plugin, so when you release your newer config wizard, it'll get uploaded to the newest plugin version when you do the upload of the wizard. It's very handy. The other thing, I have the Box 293 demonstration wizard, and that doesn't have the serialized arguments that you're talking about.
Yep, it has the session ones.
And it's very heavily commented, like when you click on stage 1, it explains what the code, the underlying PHP code is, so it shows you on the screen, and it has some demonstration drop boxes, and it shows you how you pass the data from one stage to another stage. And another one to look at if you want to play with Ajax is the EMC Clarion one. You might not have an EMC Clarion, but it has on the first stage where it asks for the IP address of your device. It also asks for the username and password that you're using to talk to the EMC Clarion with, and it has a test button, so that test button does an Ajax request to another PHP file, which goes and talks to the underlying Nagios XI CLI and then gets a response back. And when you get onto the next stage, you can query the LUNs or the RAID groups on the SAN, and it'll bring that and load it dynamically, and you can tick whatever boxes. And then if you go on to the next stage and come back again, those boxes are already ticked. It's a really good example of going backwards and forwards. You know, if you had selected something and you populated it, then it will be repopulated again, because you might have 200 volumes, you might have ticked 10 out of 200. You don't want to have to tick those ones again and remember what you did. And so there's some good examples there of how you can pass the data backwards and forwards and make it easier for the user to actually, the person using it, not to get that frustration like, oh, why are you asking me this? I already selected it.
Or you accidentally go back and then you go back forward and then all your data is missing. Yep.
With the next release that comes out, anything that we create ourselves, is it going to be impacted? And if so, even if we're using some of the wizards now, are you going to have release notes in there so that we will know which ones are impacted with the next releases that come along?
You shouldn't have any impact if you were to make a config wizard right now for something that you have. If you were to create it right now and use it and upgrade your Nagios to say 2014, it's not going to change the way that your wizard functions now, at least not in the way that it runs through stage 1 and stage 2. It's not going to change. That's not going to be affected by the upgrade. So it should still work as long as you don't use anything that gets deprecated when XI gets upgraded.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Like if you edit an existing wizard and a later upgrade includes that existing wizard, but a newer version, your customized one will get overwritten by the system. So
yeah, if you customize a default config wizard that we've already made, then yeah, it would be overridden by ours. But if you made your own, we're not gonna like erase all your config wizards out of your folder.
Just a note on the 2014 question. We don't plan on planning on we're not planning on changing the API essentially that you use to create wizards. If anything, we'd extend it, but we don't want to go back and change all of our wizards, you know, unless we absolutely have to. So we're careful about backwards compatibility. What's been mentioned about smarter wizards, you know, in 2014 is basically, you know, in the second stage, you know, of the wizard, it would automatically go out and query the box that you want to monitor to make smart decisions about presenting you with the default options, so that you don't need to check each box manually. And I think there's some examples out there already on Exchange, so that have employed that kind of stuff. But we won't break anything, hopefully.
There's actually several examples of some of the smarter wizards that currently exist. One is the VMware wizard. So if you took a look at that, that's a wizard that actually goes out to, say, for example, a ESX host or a vSphere host, queries a list of guests off of the host, and then displays them logically, adds them into the UI, similar to what Troy just described. So there are examples out there, and obviously we're going to work to make, you know, the rest of the wizards that fall into a category like there's certain drives on a machine. You shouldn't have to know that ahead of time. If there's a way for the wizard to query that data, we're going to work to get those in there too.
Are there any more questions? Yes.
Could you put again the pages when I can get the samples for Wizard and
sure.
if I need to get it? That's it.
Yeah, these are also fairly high on Google. If you want to search for developing a component in Nagios XI or developing a config wizard in Nagios XI, these should be coming up pretty much #1. So you can add it to, it's assets.nagios.com/download/nagios xi/docs, and then the name right there. It'd be easier to just, take a photo. They're pretty long.
It's easier, you know.
Yeah, and this will be up, and I know that it seems really rushed, and I have to talk about this, and there's so many things. I could probably sit here and stand here and go through a wizard with you, and it would take all day. But in general, this is the format that they go through. A wizard has many steps, and they're called stages inside, and it's all in a case statement. And I think that that'll hopefully get you at least a little bit of information on, how this is actually working behind the scenes, so that maybe you can go dig into one and say, okay, I remember hearing this, that stage 1 does this. I remember hearing that stage 2 does this, and be able to actually edit it and be able to figure out how to do it yourself. Because it is a learning process, and if we were doing this, I would probably want to do it as like a workshop where you would get to actually sit down and test one, because me showing you code is a lot harder than you being able to look at code on your computer and follow it yourself too.
Just one last thing. And Jake did mention this earlier. It really does help taking an existing wizard or a component that does something similar to what your desired outcome is. If you take a look at the existing layout format, you can really modify that very, very rapidly if you have some PHP experience to deploy what you're looking for much more quickly than if you were going to just start writing scratch and had to actually know what it all does. Most of the items are already laid out in a very similar configuration wizard or a component. Pardon me? Yeah, exactly. Find and replace for, well, most specifically like the naming convention that you had outlined. Obviously, you don't want to have names that clobber one another. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that you find and replace the names. But usually that's, it's pretty quick. Wouldn't you say, Troy? Yeah.
Anybody else? This is kind of nice. We got a little bit of an intimacy going on here.
It's like a fireside chat in here without the fire. I just actually wanted to in here determine how many of you are actually looking at writing custom wizards or components for XI. Sounds like a couple. And are you? Yeah, Troy, we know you've written many of them for sure. Are they generic ones that other XI users could find useful? Or are they ones that are specific to your infrastructure?
Our intents are very specific.
Internal.
Obviously, we could brainstorm as much as we want, but I could think of one specific one that would benefit us, may benefit someone else, would be an integration to the JIRA product for our ticketing and workflow. I know that Nagios has its incident management product, but since we are already using JIRA with pretty good success, it would be very interesting for us to be able to use that component as a quick action off of a service or whatnot, either as part of acknowledging the alert or by creating the ticket right away. But that's something I'd like to bring up for discussion with my, with the people that will be, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
You could do something like getting there's a ping component and a traceroute component, and that adds a little ping icon or a traceroute icon to your service or your host. And that's a good find and replace edit one where you could link it to a URL to your ticketing system or something like that. So it's one of those tweak and fiddle and see what you can get working yourself, or they might do it for you.
Yep, and to extend on that too real quick too is the callbacks that were listed, that is a quick action button. And you'll see that when you do open the ping one, that quick action is where the callback is calling a function that displays that, and you can do whatever you want. So you could pop up a window, or you could send something to JIRA, or you could do a component like the reactor event handler uses a callback that actually happens on notifications and state changes. If you really wanted to make something that would send something to JIRA to create like some sort of, I'm not quite sure what they're called, like a ticket type thing that says, oh, this service is down or whatnot.
In addition to that, real quick, there's already a component that gives you the flexibility to do that. Just want to point it out. It's called the Actions component. Its menu item is, if you just go to Admin, Manage Components, Actions, it's right toward the top, and you just click Settings. It actually lets you do one of two different things. You can either it will add a quick action to either host services. You can limit it down to specific hosts, specific service groups, host groups, etc. And then in addition to that, you have the option to do one of two things. You can either have the quick action call a URL of your choosing, passing in macros parameters from the particular host or service, or you can actually call an underlying command from the Linux command line. You just pass in the command, any macros that you want to be populated, and you could use that to actually have a single button that calls your JIRA API, passes the information in.
You good? You got that answered? I'm impressed, guys. This is, I think maybe it's a small group. People are more willing to talk. It's doing good. Ethan, you had something? You look like you're about ready to.
We're in a fireside chat room, so for next year, planning next year's conference. For those of you who are looking at developing wizards or components for XI, would you find it beneficial if we had a session, with Jake or somebody, to actually work through some code, or get your hands on code and test it out, kind of, like a workshop or install fest type of situation, like a dev fest? Show of hands, yes, no, maybe, all right.
I think it's always nice to whatever you do in this world is hands-on. You kind of learn and you see as you're doing it, All right, guys. Anybody else? Thanks, guys.